that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Hey,
That was
Maggie. Good to see
Maggie and Vern.
you. Oh, good to see you, Vern. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to take a couple of minutes to let people get connected. So feel free to put in the chat your name, where you're from, what organization or faith community you're with. And we'll get started here in just a few minutes.
Alan, good to see another familiar face here. Good company we have.
Yeah, I see Maggie Finfrock too. Good to see you, Maggie.
Always good to see you.
Hi, Maggie.
Hello, dear one. I just want to jump in the phone and be there.
You could have just come over, Maggie. I think you live down the street. Geneva, just let me know when you're ready to begin. I don't know how long you want to wait for people to stream in or whatever.
Got one more person connecting right now, and then I think if they're on now. So I think I'll just jump into the introduction. That's you. Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Geneva Blackmer. I'm the Interim Executive Director for the Interfaith Center at Miami University. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that seeks to unify people through relationship building, dialogue, and social action. And this program is generously funded by the Faith and Health Pipeline Grant from Interfaith America, formerly known as Interfaith Youth Work. And I'm very happy to have Josh here with us today, our esteemed speaker, whose biography is very long, but he has somehow managed to condense it into 2 sentences. So thank you for that. So the Reverend Dr. Joshua Pzakwitz is a licensed psychotherapist and a registered psychiatric nurse. He's also a priest and Zen teacher. Josh currently serves as a clinical director in a university health center, as a seminary professor, and an author. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Josh.
Great. Well, thank you, Geneva. Always good to be with you good folks at the Interfaith Center, and good to be amongst some good company here and the folks that are joining us in the meeting room, and whoever else is on the live streams, I'm sure. It's always interesting to see such good colleagues and teachers and friends here, because then I start thinking, well, what could I possibly have to say to these people? But maybe what I can do is honor some of you by sharing some of the lessons that you've imparted to me that I've interpreted, and then also try to share in my own work. So if I can be a digital native and share my screen here, I do have a PowerPoint today. And Geneva, are we up and running with that?
Yep, I can see it
Okay,
perfectly.
great. Well, there we go. All right. So the theme today that we're going to be talking about is the clinician as contemplative, and we have this lovely subheading: Inner Formation for Outer Compassion. Um, Geneva gave a little bit of my background. I'm a clinician in a number of ways, both in proper healthcare and in chaplaincy, but also a cleric. I've spent time in Zen monasteries and in Christian contemplative formation, and ongoingly, that's it's an important part of my professional life, is bridging these two streams of endeavor. When we think about contemplation or monasticism, even as it relates to, sorry there, medicine or the practice of healthcare, sometimes those can seem like really diverse streams. I was recently at a lifestyle medicine conference and was really interested to hear one of the breakout sessions was about how clinicians can start talking about religion, can start talking about faith in a manner that allows them to empower their patients to um, move towards better clinical outcomes. For instance, if you belong to a religious tradition that advocates for vegetarianism, well, one of the lifestyle medicine competencies that we talk about is encouraging people to a plant-based whole foods diet. And we know that that's tied to good outcomes. And perhaps by talking to people about their faith and their personal commitments, we can encourage them to apply those things. Into their life in a direction that intersects with, well, healthcare properly. And that's a lovely thing. However, I find that practically there's a lot of difficulties with doing that. Just today, I'm a psychotherapist, and I had a patient in my office who is a pretty devout Christian. And I found that we got into some conversation about how their approach to their Christian faith praxis can inform some of the mental health issues that we're dealing with. And that always, even from someone that's both a cleric and a clinician, feels like something that's a little bit foreign. It's a little bit awkward to occupy both of those roles. And something that I think is a growing point for us in this arena is perhaps to start thinking about how the praxis of faith and contemplation by clinicians can inform their clinical practice and make them more effective, how it can inform their presence in the clinical arena, how it can inform their ability to show up with authenticity and integrity and a sort of concentration that is itself healing. So hopefully that's what we're going to look at a little bit today as we move forward in this. I do want to preface that I have a slideshow today. I don't usually use one of those, so I'm hoping it'll keep us on track to stay within our designated hour here without me freeform going off the rails for 3 hours like I get to do in my university classes. But I do want to say that my cadence is usually fairly quick, and sometimes that can be overwhelming for people. I apologize for it, but sometimes I just don't catch myself. But thankfully, this is being recorded. So we'll be able to go back and revisit some of the themes if you'd like to. I'm reminded that all of my students that have had me in classes before always tell the new students in the incoming classes, well, Dr. Paskowitz is a bit like being in the middle of a hurricane. He speaks quickly and throws a lot at you, and honestly, most of it's going to fall off. But my hope is that you'll still go home or walk away from this meeting saturated with enough things that have stood out to you to inform your own ongoing exploration around this theme. Um, this is an interfaith center, and while we're going to draw from my own background in Catholic Christian mysticism and Zen Buddhism, and even perhaps the original religion of the secular West, psychoanalysis, I want to look at religion through kind of a broad lens. So as we go forward, we're going to talk about faith praxis and clinical praxis in the most universal ways that are possible. So, most of you here have probably read the overview and the outcomes that we've written for this session. So, what we're going to aim to do over the next 50 minutes or so is to explore how spiritual formation, especially contemplative practice, can deepen a clinician's presence, resilience, and ethical attunement in healthcare and caregiving settings. We're going to try to, rather than separate spiritual life from professional practice, reimagine professional practice of caregiving as a contemplative vocation in and of itself. And we'll draw from those three arenas that I just spoke about before, hopefully in broadly accessible ways to physicians, nurses, psychotherapists, social workers, chiropractors, clinical chaplains, and students, anybody that's involved in the practice of clinical caregiving. So, what are our specific objectives? Well, we're going to hope to define contemplative presence and distinguish it from mindfulness or stress reduction modalities otherwise. We're going to hope to reflect personally on how our own spiritual and religious identities shape our caregiving postures. And we're going to engage in maybe one or two exercises that we can hope to adapt in our daily life and practice to live into this joint role of clinician contemplative. We'll look to articulate the relationship between inner formation and sustainable and ethical caregiving, and hopefully identify some resources that we can utilize to support our growth in that arena going forward. So let's make some connections, contemplatives and clinicians. Well, In the history of religion, in the history of healthcare, contemplatives, monastics in particular, have a long history of intermingling with healthcare. Indeed, throughout much of history in several contexts, both in Europe and Asia, we find religious professionals often occupying the role of healer. Of course, we can talk about cura animarum, the healing of people and souls. The word psychotherapy itself means the cure of souls. But this goes beyond that perhaps perennial religious task of working with the psychospiritual and also looks toward the history of monasteries functioning as literal hospitals. We look at monks functioning as hospitalers in various points of history. Indeed, some of the oldest hospitals in the world, some of which are still functioning, were established by monastics. The Camaldolese order in Italy established a monastery, I think, in 1014, and by 1046, that was a fully functioning apothecary and hospital that, in fact, is still running in part today. So the monastic impulse has been by way of proximity to the human condition, often wrapped up in caring for our physical bodies and the bodies of wayfarers finding their way into and around these communities. Um, but there's some analogs that we can draw from how that happened that I think are relevant today. So often monasticism and the contemplative impulse has been something that has drawn people away from um, city centers, has drawn them away from empire and the reaches of government into the deserts, into the forests. Naturally, they need to take care of themselves there. Um, but I find today that impulse to practice a purer form of being that the monastics and contemplatives have carried is something that many healthcare workers are encountering. And the advent of managed care organizations and healthcare approval processes for insurance reimbursement, with increased demands on productivity and the number of people we need to push through and see in a day, it feels as though what we're trained for in our vocations and how we're taught to practice the ideal that we're imbued with is not often practical to do in the system. And people are responding to that in different ways. We are seeing people drawing away from the system and building primary care practices that don't do insurance reimbursement, that are separate from large healthcare conglomerates. And it's a similar impetus when we see how do we maintain fidelity to our vocation between healthcare and contemplation. So in some ways, clinicians find themselves in the desert or being drawn to the desert, but perhaps not having the resources to thrive in the realities of that place. So I've talked about this a little bit, but looking at the crisis of presence in modern healthcare, well, what is the state of the healing arts? Well, we just talked about in the past 50 to 70 years, we've had the advent of managed care organizations. We've seen electronic medical records come into being. I lament seeing a lot of my psychotherapist colleagues with laptop screens nestled in front of them as they're meeting with their patients, taking notes just to make sure that they can keep up with required reporting standards to make sure that people are going to get paid and that the whole industry doesn't collapse. That is a crisis of presence. How often do we hear about people talking about going to their provider that is, in fact, not even nestled with a laptop in front of them, but perhaps turned facing a screen, asking them rote questions that are being pushed forward by the practice software, and the patient is perhaps entirely missed? If it's not trying to fandangle the paperwork, if it's not trying to keep up on the note taking and charting that's required, we see increased productivity demands, a push toward profit over people, making sure we get the number of folks in and through the building so that everybody's paycheck can clear and that the place can stay operational. This
Mm.
results ultimately in a disconnection with patients and with wider interdisciplinary team members. I find so often my fellow clinicians are so wrapped up in the details of just keeping the practice moving that sometimes they can't even communicate with one another. And the practice of healthcare has grown in such a way that there are no experts in the whole human. And so we have to communicate with experts in the various systems of the body that can look at the person in those ways, but often it's disintegrated. And this is frustrating. It's frustrating for patients, it's frustrating for providers. And so, what were the symptoms of this disconnection? Well, we see consistently compassion fatigue, moral injury, and depersonalization. And that depersonalization is really a two-way phenomenon. We can depersonalize as providers. We can be in the room, but not really present. I had a psychotherapy professor that used to say, I am foggy, depersonalization. I'm here, but there's something ethereal and disconnected that's built into me fundamentally. But also, we can depersonalize the people that we're there to care for and care about. We can see them as numbers. We can see them as, oh, the seventh patient that I have to see today. And our caregiving suffers. Our mutual humanity suffers. So connection is important. We have to find some way to overcome this disconnection. And so what is connection? Well, connection is about presence. And presence is primarily mediated by attention. I love this quote from Simone Weil. Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. And in a system that is so often anything but generous, as we think about for-profit healthcare systems and profit-driven metrics for productivity, we can find it difficult to inject generosity into our practice. And that's such an important part of the historical healthcare paradigm. So attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. I sometimes like to say that attention itself makes sacred, attentiveness itself sanctifies. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along, especially as we consider attentiveness as the primary mechanism of contemplative formation, praxis, and life. So, the question or the invitation I'd like to pose to everybody, if not rhetorically for the time being, we'll have a discussion period, I hope, towards the end of our time together. What would it look like as a caregiver, as a clinician, as a provider, if we understood our presence rather than our mere productivity metrics themselves to be our greatest offering, and indeed the offering that we have the ability to control? So, as we move into that, I said we needed to define religion and probably contemplation in a clinical way, in a way that's going to be accessible to people of broad or perhaps even no faith background. And I often struggle to do that until I discovered Clifford Geertz, a famed anthropologist, who offered a wonderful conceptualization of how we can understand religion and spirituality. Geertz offers us this. Religion is a special system of symbols that does four things. It establishes powerful, pervasive, and long lasting moods and motivations in people. And it does that by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence, an understanding or a schema of how the world works and where we are situated within it. And then religious practice works to clothe those conceptions with such an aura of factuality, of certainty even, that the moods and motivations that they inspire seem uniquely realistic, or perhaps even beyond seem, become uniquely realistic to us. Religions do this in a number of ways to a number of different outcomes. Certainly, we understand that across the family of faiths, there are an infinite number of worldviews, and in a way, they're all legitimate. But we have to ask, as clinicians, as we look at being clinician contemplatives, how can we engage religion in a way that is intentional and honest and allows us to practice our faith formation in a way that stands up to the rigor that we would demand anything else we do in the clinical arena. So I think that's a good starting point for thinking what is a religion and how we can look at religion with a sense of the universal. And seeing as we're talking about contemplation, well, what the heck is that? Well, per the lovely Merriam-Webster dictionary, there's two definitions that I think are important. 1B defines contemplation as a state of mystical awareness of God's being, and definition 3 as the act of regarding steadily. I'm a big word fan. I think that words have meaning and that we should pay attention to those meanings and have some precision in our language. I think it's a helpful thing to do, especially in the sometimes amorphous realm of, well, both clinical practice and religion. And so looking at the etymology of this word contemplation, we come to the Latin word contemplationem, which literally means to mark out a space for observation. Contemplation, temple, literally to mark out a temple, a place where we can observe the sacred. So the clinician as contemplative as a clinician that builds a spiritual praxis, a religious discipline that allows them to encounter the clinical endeavor as a sacred act, as a place where our attention can make sacred any task that's at hand. And that attention, time and time again, we'll find, makes all the difference. So, what would the implications of clinician as contemplative be? Well, if contemplation is about the mystical awareness of the presence of God, if it's about carving out a temple or a space to bear witness to the sacred, how would that inform our clinical practice? I think we can say a lot about petriology and God in general, but God here, for our purposes, might be thought of as effectively a representation of the sacred. And what is sacred? Well, it's that which is of ultimate concern. And we have to ask ourselves, what is that for us? As a nurse, I've seen any number of my colleagues get into the business because, well, healthcare historically has been recession free. And wouldn't it be great to be in a recession free vocation that allows you to make a decent living and perhaps even help people? But increasingly, I see people getting into advanced clinical practice really with the motivation just to make more money. And that's legitimate. We all have to make a living and go through the world with a modicum of comfort that allows us to be amidst, well, the elements or whatever else we want to say. But often what's missing is a true sense of call to what we're doing. What is the matter of ultimate concern? And what I can say is if we don't carve that out expressly, if we don't find some way to recalibrate ourselves to our vocational calling in a way that's sustainable, that's about caring, that's about interdependence, it's about all of these religious values, what we find 10 out of 10 times is burnout. And that burnout is often elicited through things like, well, this is unsustainable, but at least I can make some money, maybe retire early and then do something that I'm interested in that matters. So there's a conversation to be had here too about vocational discernment, and maybe we'll get to that a little bit later. But for the sake of this conversation, assuming that most people here at the Oxford Interfaith Center gathered for a conversation or a lecture, whatever this is, about contemplation and clinical practice, I can assume, I think, that these two things are of value, if not amorphous at this point. How do I tie in the contemplative, monastic, faith-based impulse to caregiving with my role in a way that's sustainable? So I ask, what is that for us? What is of ultimate concern? I love as we mine the spiritual traditions of the world, we find lots of wonderful suppositions that I think we can co-opt directly into, well, every aspect of our life, but certainly clinical practice. In the Benedictine tradition of Catholicism, the rule of Saint Benedict opens with the words abscolta, which is also auscultate. We use that a lot in clinical practice with our stethoscopes. Listen. Benedict says, listen, my children, incline your attention with the ears of your heart. And essentially goes on to lay out this life of spiritual practice that is built with that type of contemplation, listening, paying attention, showing up consistently with the ears of our hearts, and then to welcoming all as Christ, as God, as the sacred incarnate, as the most important thing. We also find in the Catholic spiritual tradition, the Christian spiritual tradition more broadly, that human beings, all human beings, are imbued with a sense of intrinsic dignity and integrity that is wrapped up in this concept of imago Dei, that human beings reflect the image and likeness of the sacred itself. If we can carve that out in our contemplative practice as a continual point of reference, how would that change what it is we do? How would it make our work more valuable to ourselves and to our patients, and frankly, more sustainable? I was listening to a podcast recently that had an interview with a Benedictine monk, and he was talking about his discernment to that vocation. And his first visit to a Catholic monastery, he met with a Catholic spiritual director, an older Benedictine monk, that opened up his presentation on Benedictine contemplative spirituality with this question. He said, if I were to hit you with my cane, what would Christ do? And this younger monk, who was not a monk at the time, who was discerning his call, reflects that many of the people that were at that spiritual direction session, that lecture, if you will, came up with all sorts of ideas. Well, maybe you shouldn't hit me with the cane. Well, maybe Christ would still love you and forgive you. Or maybe Christ would condemn you, whatever the case may be. And the older Benedictine spiritual master says, no, no, no to all of these. And finally, he says, if I were to hit you with my cane, Christ would say, ouch. Now that's almost a Zen koan for those of you that might be familiar with that, but that's a true sense of embodied spirituality, welcoming all as Christ, welcoming the patient in front of you, the person in front of you perennially as the most important thing. Along those lines, I like to remember with Christ saying ouch, the patient saying ouch, the postulant saying ouch, that the word patient, as we look at it in healthcare, means one who suffers. That's an interesting thing to remember, rather than one who pays the bill. Rather than one who complains too much, rather than one who shows up to the ER inappropriately with non-emergent situations all the time, rather than the one who may be just drug seeking, rather than the one who just complains about topical issues and doesn't know how to frame them in the wider sense of the suffering as the world. No, it's the one who suffers. It's the Christ who's saying, ouch. How does that orientation change the clinical endeavor for us? There's been a movement in the healthcare system to get away from the word patient. And in the less honest but more easy to hear context, we say, well, we want to empower people to not be in a subsidiary relationship where they go seek the care of a provider. We want to make sure that the patient is more equitable. So we've moved toward using the word client, which I think actually reverses those concerns. And even I'm seeing these days the words healthcare consumer. And this is what I mean about the monastic impulse to withdraw to the desert. When I hear these things, it's almost too much. It's thinking this work cannot actually happen in this arena anymore. But if we can cultivate a movement of people who sacralize with their attention and show up with a vocational calling and work prophetically against the machinations of the depersonalized healthcare system, we can get back to doing that work of being with our patients who are suffering and providing healing attention that is a renewable resource born of our own faith praxis. So, on seeing and noticing, we've talked a lot so far about how attention and intention are important. I would argue that attention is the most important thing we have to offer. It's the deepest fruit of true presence. And all of our skills, all of our theories, all of the techniques that we cultivate in our years of education to become clinicians really depend on that. If we can't meet the patient, if we can't meet their suffering almost anew, then we risk missing the patient. I think it's interesting that we define the healthcare relationship through the act of taking notice itself. In our common lexicon, in our common jargon, we talk about being seen by our providers, right? Well, I was seen by my doctor, or I'm going to see my doctor. That is the essential essence of what we do in this work. And yet, so often we can have a clinical encounter where we not only figuratively miss and don't see our patients, but perhaps as we're charting on our EMR, where we actually don't even look at them. And that's a travesty because noticing itself is healing. I recall I was having some significant health challenges a number of years ago. And I didn't have a primary care provider. I was being a younger person at the time and chasing insurance as a great many people have to do. But finally had to find a new provider. And the first one that was accepting patients I just signed up for. And this was a gentleman I recall, interestingly, was trained at the Leningrad Institute of Sanitation, which I thought was quite interesting. But it was one of those typical encounters where I went in at an initial appointment. I tried to share the maladies. I tried to share the suffering that I was in the midst of. Probably a little bit hyperbolically, honestly, because I hadn't been seen by a provider in some time. And this gentleman well-intentioned as he may have been, was on his computer the whole time, dismissed about half of my complaints, and then I swear to goodness, tried to offer me an opioid painkiller, that's verbatim, instead of doing any more investigation into the cause of the issues that I was having. Needless to say, that was the first and last appointment. And finally, I got a recommendation to another provider, and I showed up perhaps more just frankly upset and concerned about what was going on, and maybe even exaggerating all of the other smaller issues that were contributing to what I thought was this bigger issue. And I was so taken aback in 2021 or whatever the case may have been, to have a provider that had a computer to the side, that sat on a stool, that came close to me, that looked at this little rash I had on my arm, didn't even put on gloves, held my hand, felt it, and said, "Oh, yeah, we can just give you this for that. That would be fine." All of a sudden, I felt all of those concerns, or at least 75% of them, melt away. So I can ask for this other thing. I hear you. Let's put in those tests. When are you available? We can go get some imaging done. That was what inspired me not only to pick this provider, but to stay with that provider, because the attention that he provided not only inspired me to understand and appreciate my own dignity that I would like, as all people would, to affirm as there, but also it literally ameliorated almost all of the suffering and concern that I was having. We know in the realm of psychotherapy in particular, but also in physical medicine, that the presenting complaints that our patients have almost always spontaneously resolve. One thing that I reiterate time and time and time again to my psychotherapy students is that the presenting issue is not the issue. It's not to say that it's not an issue, but it's to say it's usually the comfortable thing, the topical thing that I share as an invitation for you to actually see me. Healing happens when we simply pay attention, and then we can get down to the real work. In the Zen Buddhist tradition, the monks have a wonderful, wonderful saying. One moment of pure attention equates to one moment of pure enlightenment. And the enlightened experience is, of course, the primary rationale or reason or motivation for practicing. And attentiveness is that thing itself. It's nothing more than that. But to do that well requires formation, requires praxis, requires an ongoing commitment. So another thing I'd like to think about, and I talked about this briefly in the introduction, is what is the role of spirituality in the clinical arena? Well, unlike what I think some of my well-meaning colleagues have been trying to do by inspiring clinicians to co-opt religious practice in the lives of their patients to move them toward better health outcomes, I like to think that for the clinician contemplative, religion and spirituality, your contemplative praxis is chiefly for you. The praxis of our faith, our commitments to seeing and beholding the world in this sacred way, are the lenses, are the schemas that allow us to meet the suffering of the world, both inside and outside of our clinics, with a meaningful system of understanding and acceptance that brings us the type of sobriety that is required to be able to behold, to do good, to bring about healing, while not being destroyed by the forces that, well, are working toward the antithesis of that, or by the suffering that is so heavy that we really can do nothing about but behold. I'm reminded of another axiom, sometimes attributed to St. Francis of Assisi. Preach the gospel, preach the good news at all times, but only when necessary, use words. In other words, the fruits of our contemplative practice, the sharing of those things happens by means of our presence itself. Words are not really necessary. So we've talked a little bit about contemplative formation, kind of generally. And being a contemplative is really a verb. It's not something we arrive at, it's something we aspire to. Contemplation is an action, it's an invitation, it's a way of being that we are formed in and that forms us. And in spirituality, when we talk about formation, we're talking about something that is essentially, most essentially, I think, a commitment to a specific way of being. And it's a commitment that we view as the most important thing, the sacred, that we return to again and again and again. In the Zen tradition, there's this notion of shugyo, which means practice. But shugyo in the Japanese culture, which is derived from Zen, is a practice that is maybe the sushi chef taking 10 years to learn just how to make the omelet, just how to make the tamago, or just 5 years to learn how to make the rice for the sushi. Uh, it's a commitment to something that is perhaps even topically boring. We think once we know it, we know it. But to show up to it as if it were anew and to perfect the minutiae that nobody else could possibly even see or discern from the outside, that's shugyo. That's formation. It's to shape one's will and being in accordance with our commitments to what we find and hold to be the most important, the sacred. And so I think for the clinician to be a contemplative, we have to reframe our clinical work, our identity as a whole, as spiritual work. It's not that it's not also clinical. It's that it's chiefly, however, a spiritual act of people meeting and beholding one another. And I think it's worth then defining what we do as vocation rather than profession. To look to Merriam-Webster again, we can talk about vocation as being a summoning or a strong inclination to a particular state or course, especially a divine call to religious life. Conversely, we look at a profession, which I think we also, as clinicians, all have a profession, a calling that requires a specialized knowledge and often a long and intensive course of academic preparation. But that long and intensive course of academic preparation, which is also usually quite expensive, is not usually enough to carry us forward over a lifetime of practice. It's not enough to set up a container of formation, of shugyo. In vocation, when we understand what we do as vocation, the clinician as contemplative or the contemplative clinician is to understand our calling as something that is a continual point of reference of encountering the sacred. So, how do we do that? There's a wonderful tradition that came about in the Western religious world about 100 years ago in 1925 called clinical pastoral education. And this was founded by a man named Anton Boysen, who was quite interesting in his own right, a sometimes schizophrenic inpatient who became a Congregationalist Presbyterian minister and a forester, among other things. But eventually, amidst his experience of being in an inpatient institution and having been a graduate of the seminary, thought we really need to merge these two things. This is an impersonal environment. People aren't met. We need to find a way to make the theological perspective, the clinical perspective. So he initiated clinical pastoral education with the intention of giving pastoral care providers a clinical year to help them understand medicine and function better as chaplains in those arenas. But eventually, as the field has grown today, also now we're seeing CPE for nurses to train clinicians, for instance, as contemplatives, as theologians, as people that can marry concern for the most important, the sacred, with concern for the topical and sometimes deep existential suffering that's intrinsic to human life. Boysen used this turn of phrase that he said, the living human document is our object of inquiry. As we look back to Benedictine spirituality again, which is a contemplative monastic tradition, the primary discipline is this thing called lectio divina, or divine reading. And I think it's interesting to think of our job, regardless of what our clinical role is, I think this applies across the board, as being the divine reading of the living human document. Lectio Divina is a specific contemplative exercise. It's something that the rule of Benedict requires abbots of monasteries to carve out specific time for the monks to do throughout the day, every day of the year. They sing the Psalms in community contemplatively, but then they also go and read scripture and other sacred writings through this fourfold movement of lectio, meditatio, oratio, and contemplatio. And I think that that's a paradigm that we can utilize even in quick succession, which all of these contemplative practices with practice and formation over time can be run through relatively quickly, almost even instantly. And I think that's actually the goal, but it also informs a sense of presence that is somehow more intentional. Even if it's quick, it's slow, if that paradox makes some sense. So how might we apply these paradigmatic movements of Lectio Divina to the clinical practice? Well, I think the key is remembering, as Boysen said, the person sitting before us, the Christ before us, the most sacred incarnate before us, is a living human document, and they are sacred, and we encounter them as such. So the first step is to encounter them. It's Lectio, which literally means reading. It's a slow, if not intentional, attentive, and holistic perception. We cannot do good clinical work without beholding the patient. That's the first thing we have to do. And if we don't have 20 minutes to do it, because increasingly we have 15-minute clinical timeframes, well, we can at least infuse the beholding that we can do with the intention of sacred reading. This practice, this charism, if you will, carries with it a weight of thousands of years of people doing this. And we can latch onto that archetypal weight and carry it into the clinical arena with ongoing formation. So as we read, as we encounter the text of the living human document, we then might move into the second movement of meditatio. That's honing our attention to that which stands out or that which demands attention. We're taught as clinicians in physical medicine and nursing to see, how is a patient dressed when they come into the room? What is their gait? Are they protecting something? Are they holding something? How is their speech? What does their processing speed look like? When we behold holistically the living human document before us, just as in sacred reading, typically things that demand our attention in that moment, that perhaps the sacred itself is beckoning us into, pop out. And so meditatio is taking note of those things and then leaning into them, maybe directing the clinical encounter for the rest of the allotted time in that direction. The next movement to think about is a little bit interesting. It's oratio, which literally is prayer. Prayer in the Lectio Divina paradigm is really an open-ended inquiry of the divine, of the sacred, of God to give us direction. We might think it's the invitation of our holistic perception and our taking note of what needs to be worked on to guide us intuitively into how to be with that particular type of suffering. We also might utilize that prayerful response to the meditative bits that stick out as an invitation to return to our foundational commitments. What is our vocation? What is ours to do? How do I endeavor to show up as a healer in this environment? And I ask God, the universe, my own commitment, my own spiritual practice, I make inquiry of it to allow me to do that well. To, as I move forward with the meditation, the paying attention to the things that demand attention, to do so with integrity, with authenticity, with fidelity to how I am committed in my vocation to being in this role and in this relationship. And then finally, we have in this Lectio Divina process or paradigm, the final stage of contemplatio. Now, what I think is interesting is that this is not always a given in the practice of monastic Lectio Divina or divine reading. Contemplatio is sometimes thought of as a grace. It's sometimes thought of as something that we sit and wait for, and we have these moments of divine union, yoga, if you will, enlightenment, that's the fullness of attention, if you will, that allow us to be a complete, whole, invested presence in the moment. That's not something we're always going to be capable of doing, and this process recognizes that. But what it invites us to do when we don't have those graceful moments of being the clinician that we're called to be, the contemplative that we're called to be in the clinical arena, that we return to the process, that we return to the foundational commitments of our vocation. And increasingly over time, what seems to happen is that clarifies, and we find more and more expeditious ways to arrive at that contemplation, which is not just a mystical awareness of our vocation coming together and being lived out in line with our intention and our formative goals, but also in a way that is intrinsically sacred and perceptible as such, not only from our vantage point, but from the vantage point of our patients. So how do we do that? We talked about some of our goals here being to differentiate the practice of contemplation from the practice of meditation or simple mindfulness-based stress reduction or something like that. It's not easy to do, but what I like to remember is that mindfulness is essentially a clinical discipline. You can bill for it now. It's been Buddhist contemplative exercise translated into clinical jargon, and then, of course, as we tend to do in the global West, sold. And when it's not that, it just tends to be something that is very goal directed, that's very symptomatic directed. How do I optimize my life? But contemplation is not about optimization, really. Optimization can sometimes be a nice side effect, if you will, but it's not the goal. It's about fidelity to the human condition. It's about fidelity to vocation, and sometimes that's not optimized to meet the demands of the world. And so I think that's what makes it different. But we have to remember meditation, mindfulness are fundamentally contemplative exercises. They move us in a direction rather than to a specific outcome. And in that way, I think they're aspirational rather than goal directed. Contemplative exercises can be sometimes heady. When we just talked about the Lectio Divina paradigm, that's something that you can just think about. But contemplative life is not something that just exists in the mind. It's a presence that's born out of a unitary, integrated awareness of body and mind. Sometimes we say body, breath, and mind, body, spirit, and mind, you could say. And I like to remind people that it's pretty much impossible to just think your way into a new way of being. Thinking's important, but we have to find ways to tie that thinking, that sometimes ethereal process of cognition, to our actual experience of the moment. And so, with that, most contemplative exercises invite us to check in with our breathing, to check in with our posture, and to check in with our orientation, both in terms of our vocational commitments, if you will, and to the intentions of the moment. So there's any number of ways of practicing this, but I think on the next slide here, nope, I don't have that slide, I don't think. I talked about, oh, there it is. It's bolded at the top. Forgive me. The simplicity of Zen. Zen is a specific school of Buddhism that literally Zen is a Japanese word that's transliterated from the Chinese Chan, which comes from the Indian word jhana, which simply means meditation or contemplative immersion. Samadhi is another word that's used. And I love the Zen paradigm because it's so profoundly simple. How do we practice contemplation on a day-to-day basis? Well, simply, in Zen, we say sit down, shut up, and pay attention. Now, for the sake of being more polite, I did say sit down, quiet down, and pay attention. But fundamentally, the practice of contemplation is tying together the work of cognition with the demands of being. So as we look at these exercises, we say that mind follows body, body follows mind follows breath, breath follows mind. There's all sorts of ways that we can look at utilizing breath and the connection of mind with our body to regulate our nervous system and all of these sorts of things. But what makes the practice of contemplation different from the practice of commodified mindfulness or stress reduction techniques, if you will, is its orientation toward a direction that's rather open-ended, that aspirational view, rather than trying to fix something in the moment. And that is important because that has sustainability. The kind of flippant utilizing this as a technique to change something effectually about myself in the moment usually doesn't. And I can tell you that from many, many, many clinical encounters as a psychotherapist and Zen teacher, it's usually not sustainable. But if we build in a contemplative aspiration, often we can get those same clinical benefits from an intervention like mindfulness that become sustainable over time because they are wrapped into one's commitment to a way of being in and of the world, not as a reaction formation toward any particular unhealthy or dislikable state of being. So how might we integrate this formation into our daily life? Well, we're not going to be able to do that in 50 minutes. We're not going to be able to do that into an hour. All we can do is hopefully set foot toward that aspiration, toward that orientation toward living into the calling, the vocation, if you will, as clinician contemplative or contemplative as clinician. So th- a number of ways you can do this. How do we carry these practices into our life? I love this idea that's been sometimes articulated about a 1 minute monastery, carrying the monastery with us, which is maybe just before you go in the room to see your next patient, pausing. The system is quick. The system is flippant sometimes. It demands that we meet a schedule and go from patient to patient to patient. And our care suffers, our attention suffers. So it can be as simple as taking a moment to pause, taking 3 intentional breaths, straightening our posture, realigning our orientation of our mind in that moment with our vocational commitment to beholding attentively as the primary work of encountering the sacred and bringing about healing, naming that specifically. And perhaps then at the end of our day, after we've done all of these check ins, sometimes missing it, sometimes not, reflecting and thinking, where did I miss the mark? Where did I show up in the way that I intended to today, and where did I not? That comes from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. We talk about the examine, looking back just briefly and finding where can I just realign or recalibrate myself tomorrow to be in a little bit more fidelity than perhaps where I was today. That's that Buddhist practice again of shugyo, of sadhana, of returning even to the minutia, of moving forward in this direction. After all, progress is just one step after another, after another, after another. So, a couple things I'd like for you to think about is, who do you want to become through the work that you do? Because whether we have an intentional formative sort of trajectory set up or not, we are shaped by how we are in the world. And if we don't pay attention to how we are being shaped by the world, we'll simply be shaped by it and often find ourselves in places we didn't intend to be: burnt out, inattentive, uncertain, depersonalized, disconnected. So we have to set up some intentionality. Who am I becoming through the work that I do? Who do I want to become through the work that I do? We might also think then, what practices help me return to my true self, to fidelity to my self concept, and to the direction that I'm committing myself to? They can be overtly religious and mined from the historical contemplative tradition, or otherwise. We might also think, what sacred texts, what stories, what rituals, what ceremonies help me to be sustained in this work, in this vocational commitment? If we don't name these things expressly, then, well, we don't go anywhere in particular. And sometimes that's okay. And joining yourself to the Tao, being in the flow of being with no intention, can be a beautiful and indeed mystical contemplative reality. However, it's not one that's often well suited to a sustainable life, not in the literal, actual mountains, deserts, and jungles. So, just some reflective prompts for you. I think at this point we have several minutes left, so I'd like to actually maybe take some time, if I can get out of my stop share here and see some faces, to talk out loud about those things, or even invite any questions or comments that you might have, if there are any.
If anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. You can also just unmute yourself. Alan?
Yeah, I'll go first. I just, Joshua, so much that you shared. It definitely could be a 3-hour session. So jam-packed. I'd say I wrote down a lot of things, and one thing that comes to me, I've always loved it. We have an American yogi who actually is known for being a baseball player, Yogi Berra, and he's known for so many yogiisms. But one of the ones he said was, we can we can we can observe a lot just by watching. So we see things, but do we really observe them? The only way we can observe is really being present,
Yeah.
like you said, attending to and paying attention.
Yeah.
So I love that.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. That's beautiful sentiment.
Yeah.
Vern?
Thank you so much. A joy to hear you so effectively. Noticing, as you described, creates a relationship between the practitioner and the patient. Do you have any guidelines for how to keep, what to look for in order to keep that relationship whole, pure, and not wrongly entangled.
Mm, mm. You know, I think that's an aspect of formation as well. And we have to think about setting the container, right? If that word contemplation can be understood etymologically to mean carving out the space, making the observatory. I love in Taoism, if you look at the Chinese characters for temple, it literally means an observatory. So you carve out the space from which you observe, and it does have bounds, right? The clinician has to have healthy boundaries, and that's for the good of the endeavor that's mutually beheld between the patient and the provider, but also for the high ethical commitment that I think we have to have. Um, so I think those guidelines are expressly defining those things. I always encourage clinicians to be in professional associations that can help do that for you. And sometimes it's a little bit better to have a rule, right? All contemplative communities have a rule that defines how we live out this vocation. Now, we live in a do-it-yourself society. Everybody wants to define their own, and that's the American way, and that's okay. It's sometimes very beautiful, but it's not without occupational and vocational hazards, right? I'm reminded of doing our own work, which is my mantra for my psychotherapy students that, get to hear it 10,000 times before they graduate. And part of our doing our own work is building that innate fidelity to those perimeters. I'm reminded there's a wonderful story about the Japanese Zen master Shunryu Suzuki Roshi of Zen Mind Beginner's Mind fame, who once had a student make a sexual advance toward him in the Dokusan room, the small room where student and teacher meet in private, intimate conversation about the most important things, the sacred in their life. And famously, Suzuki Roshi looked at the patient and said, "Oh, no, thank you. I have enough self-control for the both of us." And sometimes I think that's required. And not just around, issues of sexuality or those bounds, which by the way, is the number one way that clinicians are disciplined and lose their license, I think across the spectrum, but certainly among psychotherapists. If you look at the disciplinary boards, that's the thing that gets you. But it's also how do I practice ethically and within proper bounds in a world that is tempting me to do otherwise? I think of profit-driven for-profit healthcare systems where you might be called to not behave in fidelity with the best interest of the patient. So, um, how do we recognize, sustain, and respect that connection and that relationship that attentiveness establishes?
Thank you. Are there any additional questions? Oh,
Yeah,
Alan again?
I'll tell you, this is a kind of from personal experience just in the last week, a couple weeks. Um, I, these days in healthcare, we're talking about physicians and patients and all. And a lot of doctors, my doctor, primary care doctor's gone to having he's part of HCA. So they have a
Mm,
scribe that comes in the office, the room, the clinical,
yeah,
the room with the patient or the doctor to work the EMR on the computer, the laptop. And
yeah,
at first it was, kind of strange and unsettling. It's like, who is this person? And they're going to
you're
hear all
right.
this intimate stuff. But you know what? After a while, after a few sessions, visits, I got accustomed to it and realized now, actually having a doctor's visit a couple days ago who didn't have a scribe and was doing his own notes, I much now prefer the
Mm,
session with the doctor who has a scribe in the room typing, and my doctor gave me much more focused attention.
that's beautiful. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think I'm quite suspect of AI in general. I'm not quite a Luddite, but I flirt with that sometimes. But I think that's one of the more useful applications that perhaps we'll see if it's not totally co-opted in the wrong direction are AI scribes. So you can have a non-human entity, not quite bearing witness, but recording the things that need to be recorded so that the provider can do the essential work of actually showing up with intentionality and attention. Yeah.
Perhaps, who knows, perhaps in the future, if it is an AI, it could actually be a person scribe in a therapist, psychotherapist office.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, because I work in hospice, and a lot of nurses now, and maybe a few chaplains even, are actually taking their tablet in and typing while they're meeting. And I see what you're saying earlier. That takes away the attention. It lessens that opportunity for enlightenment and for the person to really be heard. So
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But thank you for a
Okay.
great presentation today.
Yeah. Thanks, Alan. Looks like we have a hand up. Indy Rishi Singh.
Indeed.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you so much. I was actually tuning in on YouTube and I was like, wait, hold on. Let me really quickly jump in here. This is such a
Great. Thank
great
you.
conversation, and thanks, Joshua, for tying in so many threads of spiritualities and understanding them. People have done research about healthcare and mental health and spiritual health and physical health for a long time. It's not just the Eurocentric, like, Rockefeller like funded perspective.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
many other perspectives of health, right? That we should really
Right.
entertain and educate and integrate in a lot of ways. So I'm actually excited, Joshua, and everybody here. This is so alive with us. I'm a part of this nonprofit. I'm the executive director. Actually, I don't even, it's weird saying that. But I'm also a board member with Interfaith Center. And one of the things we're doing with our nonprofit is focusing on connecting caregivers of all kinds, doctors, nurses, social workers, caregivers that show up in schools in different ways, in different
Yeah.
spaces, right? Even family caregivers. And what we've been doing is integrating and reimagining healthcare to include spirituality as medicine, to include ecotherapy and nature, and like working with nature, actually
Yeah.
doing restoration work and regenerative farming as a therapy, and also food as medicine, but connecting spiritualities to that. That actually the lack of connection between us and nature, and that like how all these spiritualities and indigenous and cultural traditions are also healthcare because they integrate
Yeah.
food and nature into their healthcare. And you can see also in Jewish and so many different traditions, there are all these like ecological mandates, right, that are actually around healthcare within the system. So, anyways, I'm going to share this link with you. I just think it's also really important that we start to create these collaborative spaces to reimagine healthcare. Like if we just talk about what's wrong, it's not going to work. And then we also need investment. So people who are
Yeah.
older, you should be investing in cooperative healthcare projects like ours or others that are building cooperative healthcare where the private equity isn't owning it. But we need the old people's money. So if you're a boomer out there, we need your money. Like you take your pension out. No, I'm serious. Take your pension out of where it's going into private equity and wars and damage and healthcare inequity. Put that money to local healthcare co-ops that are that are cooperative as well.
Well, I totally agree with you. I think that it's really important, and I think it's the leading edge of healthcare, honestly, to look at the wisdom of older non-Eurocentric traditions, and there's certainly tons of it. We've mined great information from studying traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda that continues to be, I think, a leading edge of healthcare. And one thing I love about all of those systems is that they are completely invested in the importance of the sacralizing attention of the provider and the personal spiritual formation of the provider. And it's a beautiful, important thing. And I agree with you completely. We definitely need to find and be real about investing in alternative ways to do this, because what we're doing at present with for-profit, not people-driven healthcare systems is not working and isn't sustainable, and we're
It's
seeing it
unreligious,
collapse.
it's
So,
unspiritual. Like if you're
yeah,
anywhere in the spiritual realm, you can't be like you got to
yeah,
support something else at this point. Like otherwise, we're just all driving towards a terrible death. All of us, actually, it's crazy to think about that sad part, that shadow part of it. But we're like, we don't realize
yeah.
how bad our deaths can be if we keep letting it keep going this way. Like they're not going to be pleasant deaths.
Right. Yeah, well, hopefully we can look at your organization, Geneva. I know we're going to send out a resource sheet. We'll make that available at some point in the coming hours or days, whatever the case may need be, and give some people some places to bound from and continue to explore some of these ideas. Anything else? I know that we've kind of approached our time boundary here. We're just about almost exactly an hour in, but any other comments or thoughts? Great. Well, I appreciate everybody's time today. It was certainly wonderful to be among you and to see so many friends and teachers here. I have to give a shout out to my dear mentor, Vern Barnett, who without him, I wouldn't have the lexicon to talk about attention and noticing in the way that I do. So thank you for that. And everybody have a great day.
Thank you all so much, and we will send out the link to the recording, and also we're putting together a whole toolkit as a product of this grant from Interfaith America. So we will send out Josh's guide, but there will also be a larger resource available at the end of the series of programming. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening wherever you are in the world.